1835. The American frontier. A beacon of hope in a world choked with blood and smog. Little did the hopeful citizens of a still newly independent United States know. The evils of the old world had followed them here. Sometimes it took the form of hate, of violence, of desperation and starvation. But sometimes pure evil wasn't just some abstract concept existing in and around all of us. Sometimes that evil, that pure cruelty, malice, and greed, walks in the shape of a man. One such man was James Anderson, an unremarkable name for a truly exceptional man. Exceptional in the sense that if most human beings aren't willing to sell out all of humanity for their own petty gain, James Anderson is definitely the exception. After all, it's by his design that we have SCP-001, the anomaly that set the SCP Foundation and our entire reality down its current path. Of course, you know the deal with SCP-001. Not one anomaly, but many. A collective designation for a vast number of entries, all of which spell beginnings or ends for the SCP Foundation and sometimes even our universe. Scarlet Kings, Howling Black Moons, Ouroboros Cycles, and Gate Guardians. You've heard them all and seen the files. But unlike all the others, there is no file for the factory. That's because the full story only exists in the mind of 05-1. One of the most powerful and arguably the oldest member of the SCP Foundation. He'll die before he ever commits the story to paper. Some memories are just too awful to record. Their details and implications are too painful to ever subject others to. SCP-001 isn't just about Anderson and his atrocities. It's about all the terrible nightmares that unfolded afterward, and the deal with the devil that 05-1 struck to lock them away. For now, at least. But it all begins with James Anderson. His family had become incredibly wealthy in the Revolutionary War, and in the decades since, his fortune had only multiplied, as fortunes tend to do. In the early 1800s, he began work on his beautiful and horrific magnum opus, the Anderson Factory. It would be the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution, the manufacturing plant to end all manufacturing plants. 3 stories tall and a mile wide. Company towns had existed for a long time, but this time, the factory itself was the town. It had everything a worker would ever need. They would live, sleep, play, and most importantly of all, work in the same place. They would never need to leave. All their wants and needs from cradle to grave would be met in the Anderson factory, and all that Mr. Anderson ever asked in return was loyalty and service. Was that really so much to ask from those whom he gave everything? It may sound like a horrifying form of indentured servitude to us, but to the people in the United States in the early 1830s, this kind of security and stability was a godsend. To many itinerant workers and unstable families across the plains, James Anderson seemed like a saint. Little did they know, his plans for the factory and them were anything but saintly. Nobody knows exactly what type of dark magic James Anderson devoted himself to. Many have theorized as to whether it was Satan he worshipped, ancient pagan deities, or something older and more powerful than both. In actuality, the only thing that James Anderson really worshipped was himself, and the pursuit of more material wealth and power over his fellow man. Any pacts he made with evil, timeless gods were just means to an end. The Anderson factory was a citadel to one man's cruelty and corruption, and every element of the building's design seemed to reflect that. Groups of 8 were forced into rooms together like battery-farmed chickens to maximize cost efficiency. People worked day and night in shifts of 3. Machines always rumbled and roared and chewed. When workers died in factory accidents and their blood spilled on the ground, it seemed to reveal arcane symbols carved into the stonework. These symbols were only visible when blood flowed across them. While people traveled hundreds of miles to live and work at the Anderson factory, they had no idea that they were working towards slavery, subjugation, and death under Anderson's iron will. And in some cases, fates much, much worse. The factory remained in operation like this for 40 years, while Anderson himself enjoyed a positive public reputation as a groundbreaking industrialist. How Anderson got away with his crimes for so long is sadly a tale as old as time. The factory made valuable products and an awful lot of profit. So, no matter how many rumors swirled about inhumane practices or arcane rites going on in the Anderson factory, nothing was ever done. It was just too inconvenient to ever reckon with the horrible truth underneath the productive surface. And it was truly productive. The factory was so huge and filled with such a multitude of enslaved workers, there wasn't anything they didn't produce. From textiles to technology to crops and meat, the machines were always on. The furnaces always burned. Anderson himself seemed obsessed with two things: efficiency and misanthropy, the contempt and hatred for humanity itself. He believed his workers were lower than him. They only existed as a means to his nightmarish ends. And if ever the workers became too injured to work, well, that doesn't mean that Anderson wouldn't still find ways to put them to good use. The lucky ones, starved and neglected or broken by the stress of work or the grinding gears of the machines, were used as material in the production of products. Some were drained of blood so that they could be used in the forging of metal. Others were ground up into meat slurry and used to pad out the beef, making it go further. People all across the country enjoying fine Anderson brand steaks had no idea that they were actually dining on human flesh the whole time. But as we said, the ones who ended up being cooked into steaks and hamburgers after death were the lucky ones, because at least they got to die. The truly unlucky injured workers became the subject of James Anderson's horrific occult experiments. Using a mix of twisted science and black magic, he turned men into abominations, powerful, terrifying monsters stronger and more deadly than any mortal man. Anderson was building himself an anomalous army, but it wasn't just monsters. There were just as many so-called normal humans helping him rule over the Anderson factory with an iron fist. They were vicious sadists themselves, spurred on by absolute loyalty to their immoral master. It was only after the Civil War that someone finally escaped the Anderson factory and confirmed that not only were the most horrific rumors about the place true, but they didn't even come close to covering the totality of what was going on there. When President Grant heard the reports, he was disgusted. As far as he was concerned, the atrocities of James Anderson should not be allowed to go on a minute longer. The directive was simple: find the factory, free its prisoners, and put James Anderson to death for his crimes. And thankfully, President Grant had the perfect group of operatives for the job. They were an elite unit of around 150 soldiers who performed a number of dangerous missions beyond enemy lines down south. Espionage, assassination, psychological warfare. But these missions weren't just against the Confederates. Some of the enemies they faced down south were things that could not be explained. The strange, the frightening, the anomalous. And the highest-ranking soldier in this unit was a man who would one day become the legendary 05-1. He and his men made their long and treacherous journey to the factory, a trip that would change all of their lives forever. When they first reached their destination, they first had to deal with Anderson's security force. These were men whose cruelty and loyalty to Anderson far outweighed their skill in combat. While they may have felt powerful when tormenting starving, injured factory workers, they were quickly routed and slaughtered by 05-1 and his team. When they ventured inside the factory, they were utterly appalled by what they saw. The inhuman conditions faced by Anderson's thousands of victims drove them into a blood-curdling, murderous rage. Almost half of 05-1's men were lost in the battle against Anderson's army of engineered monsters, but in the end, they prevailed. Nothing would stop them in their quest for liberation and vengeance on behalf of all that this terrible place had tormented. They fought their way to Anderson's office, where they found him cowering under his desk. For a man as despicable as Anderson, only a truly medieval execution would suffice. 05-1 and his men hanged, drew, and quartered Anderson over a period of 2 days. The sadistic madman died laughing in the end, saying that while they may kill him, his factory will never die. But the factory was no longer his. In addition to the factory's horrors, 05-1 and his men also discovered its wonders. It wasn't just normal items and monsters that the factory produced. They were also thanks to some of Anderson's arcane deals, the world's leading producer of anomalous items. Skeletal horses that never tire, shadow cloaks that could transport the wearer to different dimensions, toy guns that fire real bullets, even yo-yos that could flay the skin from anyone they touched. These were anomalous objects that could shift the balance of global power, items that could give them an advantage against the things that go bump in the night. While others among them were greedy or fearful, the inner circle of 05-1 were united in a singular purpose. Using the anomalous, they can control to contain the anomalous that they can't. This group took over the factory, making it Site Alpha, their first ever containment facility, and came to be known as the 05 Council. With funding that came from a mix of blackmail and friends in high places, this organization, a burgeoning SCP Foundation, grew more and more powerful over the ensuing decades. The tools they gained from the factory were pivotal in the continued success of their mission, and as they discovered more anomalies, they also put these anomalies to good use. But in 1911, 05-1 and his new organization came up against an enemy that even the factory's tools couldn't help them defeat. A warrior race known as the Fae, so named because their only weakness seemed to be a vulnerability to iron. But these beings were an order of magnitude more powerful than humans, or the beasts they'd once faced in Anderson's factory. The Fae handed them defeat after defeat, but soon humiliation became decimation when an army of the Fae led an assault on the factory. It was a day that only 05-1 remembered. The Fae slaughtered everyone, every guard, every researcher, every member of the 05 Council. They swept through the factory like a plague of locusts, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. Only 05-1 escaped and survived, and that's only because he ran. As he fled from the fairy forces through the halls of the factory, he came upon a door he'd never seen before, a huge golden door covered in Aramaic script. He fled inside, entering the very heart of the factory. Inside, he saw the floating dead body of James Anderson, bathed in red light. Now he was little more than the mouthpiece of the factory itself, or rather the great and unknowable powers working behind it. The factory gave 05-1 an offer, just like the offer it had given Anderson before. It would give them the power to turn back time and destroy the Fae, saving everyone that they'd slain in the factory. But in exchange, all of them would forever belong to the factory. And in a moment of weakness and fear, 05-1 took the deal. The clock was turned back to before the battle. This time 05-1 and his compatriots, all of whom except him had no idea what had happened, had the horrific weapons required to slaughter the Fae. Weapons that nobody, mortal or otherwise, could possess. They repelled the invading force easily, but knowing the horrors that came before, 05-1 refused to stop there. With the power of the Foundation and the factory behind him, he hunted down and murdered every last fairy, driving their species entirely into extinction. As far as 05-1 was concerned, it was them or him. But with the Fae utterly destroyed and the Foundation's superiority assured, a shadow was laying over 05-1. He'd made a deal with the factory, and someday it would want its pound of flesh. 05-1, rather than facing the consequences of his actions, decided to run and hide. He had the factory decommissioned and buried under the rubble, never to be used as an active Foundation base again. But just because they were done with the factory doesn't mean that the factory was done with them. One day a toy gun appeared on 05-1's desk, a toy gun that fired real bullets, just like the ones they found in the factory a century before. The factory was still waiting for its repayment. With every anomalous item from the factory that the Foundation used, the terrible place only grew in its power. Since the resurgence, 05-1 has been sending the factory sacrifices, D-classes, dead and alive, as well as agents and researchers. But as time goes on, it seems that these sacrifices aren't satisfying the factory anymore. It wants more than 05-1 can ever stand to give it. And when 05-1 refuses to give, the factory will begin to take. And what the factory wants, sooner or later, the factory will get. Now go check out Children of SCP-001, The Scarlet King. Is SCP-999 really his son? And SCP-001, The Ouroboros Cycle, the full epic story explained for more frightening and fascinating takes on SCP-001.